Hi everyone, welcome and thank you so much for checking out my channel today. My name is Tanny and I'm an independent author and somebody who just really loves a great story. So on this channel I talk about writing, books I've enjoyed, and lessons I've learned on my publishing journey. As I've mentioned before, one of the things that I love most about the indie author community is how supportive everybody is, and I really like to be supportive of other indie authors as well and read their books and review them and just kind of highlight the ones that I really have loved and enjoyed. This year I learned about an event on social media and on some book blogs that is called Self-Published Fantasy Month. And this is really just a way to showcase and spotlight some of the really amazing indie fantasy books that are out there. And since I have read and enjoyed so many really great indie fantasy books, I thought that I would make a list today to highlight some of those, and hopefully some of them will sound interesting to you so that you can check them out for Self-Published Fantasy Month. I will have links to all of these listed down in the description, so if any of them sound interesting to you, definitely go check them out. You can add them to your TBR, request them at the library, leave a review for the ones that you enjoyed. Anything that you can do to support these books I know would mean the world to the author. This list is going to be just for adult fantasy. I will have a separate list coming out next week or in a couple weeks for YA fantasy books because I do read a lot of young adult fantasy as well. Because these are all adult fantasy books, I do want to note that some of them have darker themes and difficult subject matter and content that may be upsetting to some readers, so please keep that in mind as you're going out and checking these books out. The first book I want to recommend is Shadow of a Dead God by Patrick Samphire. This is a book that I have talked about before on my channel, but I really enjoy it. I think it's a lot of fun. The story is about a mage named Nick, and he's really not the best mage in the city where he lives, but he's not the worst either. He just kind of takes on these odd jobs and is kind of trying to scrape by in life. His best friend is a thief, and so Nick and his friend get into some trouble when they go to steal something from one of the most powerful men in the city. Things end up going really wrong, and Nick and his friend end up being accused of murder. So at that point, it's up to Nick to kind of figure out how to solve this mystery and prove that him and his friend are innocent. Basically, it's a good old whodunit mystery kind of novel, but in the fantasy world with magic and with ghosts and with a main character who really cannot catch a break. Nick is a really fun main character to follow. The book is written in first person point of view and he has a very strong narrative voice. He's very sarcastic and clever and kind of funny, and so his narration is very entertaining. He's constantly getting himself into worse and worse situations and then having to scramble to try to get out of them. So you definitely feel bad for the guy and everything that he's going through, but also it's just very entertaining and very funny to see him try to get out of some of these situations with his sarcastic, snarky attitude about everything. It's really fast-paced, the magic system was really interesting, and all of the secondary characters are very interesting as well. This book was a finalist in the SBFBO competition from last year, so it's really good, and I would definitely recommend that you check it out if that sounds like a fun time to you. The next book I want to recommend is Dust on the Altar by Michelle Winkler. This is a dark urban fantasy novel with magic and witches and romance. It's set in sort of an alternate Earth where there are cities that have technology and they're more modern and ordinary people live there. But then on the outskirts of society, there are these smaller communities of witches that are magical. The witches are ostracized in this society, and our main character, Jade, is a witch who has moved away from her small town where her witch coven is, and she has moved into the city and is just trying to live kind of an ordinary life. Jade's aunt is murdered back in the small town of Sugar Hill where she's from, and so Jade ends up having to go back to Sugar Hill to take her place as coven leader and figure out what happened to her aunt. While she's there, she gets to reconnect with her magic and also with her childhood best friend Charlie, and he becomes the love interest of the story and helps Jade solve this mystery and reconnect with her magic in order to take her place as the leader of the coven. It's a really atmospheric book, and the setting of Sugar Hill especially was very well described, and it feels very real. It does have kind of a spooky vibe to it with the witches and the magic and all of that, but it's not a horror book, so it's not anything too dark or creepy. It's just kind of, I don't know, more spooky, but in a fun way. I really enjoyed the characters and especially Jade's growth as a character throughout the book, and the magic was really fun and interesting as well. We are getting into fall now, or at least probably the rest of the country is. Here in the desert where I live, it's still very extremely hot. But, you know, as things cool down for the rest of you and you get into fall, it is a good, I just think it's a good kind of cozy read for fall and would be a good one to read like during the Halloween season or something. The next book is Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. This is one that you may have seen floating around on BookTube a little bit. I know I have, and it was the SPFBO winner, a few years ago, I think. But it's really good, and there's a reason why so many people are picking it up and talking about it, because it really is, it's excellent. This is a book about war, and specifically how war impacts one family and the community where they live. The story takes place in a country called Kaigen and on a peninsula that is called the Sword of Kaigen because it is often the first point of attack for invaders. And so the people that live there are really their country's kind of first line defense in a war. The people in this community take that role very seriously, to the point that they are kind of behind the times in terms of like technology and modern developments that exist outside of their community. They have very clear gender roles and expectations, with women being caretakers and nurturers and men being more the fighters and the leaders of their society. The story follows 2 points of view. We have a mother and then her son. The son's name is Mamoru, and he's training to become a warrior like his father. I think he's about 14 or something like that. He has a lot of the same strength and power as his father, but he's still learning to kind of hone his fighting skills and control his magic. The other main character is Misaki, and she is Mamoru's mother. Misaki is very smart and strong and independent, and at one point we learn that in her past she actually traveled outside of Kaigen and spent a lot of time in the outside world. And so she really gained some independence for herself with that, but then she ended up returning to Kaigen and entering this arranged marriage with her husband, Takeru. And honestly, it's really not a great arrangement for her when the story starts. We can kind of see that she's pretty miserable and resentful about her situation and where her life has ended up. I absolutely loved Misaki as a character. She was so interesting and complex. And the themes of motherhood and sacrifice and love that we get to explore with her character were portrayed in such a nuanced way. And we don't often get to see mother characters in fantasy or see those themes explored with those characters. So it was really nice to see that, and as a mother myself, I definitely appreciated her character. There are also a few other sons in the book who are younger than Mamoru, and then we also have Misaki's husband, Takeru. And honestly, Takeru was one of my favorite characters that I've read in a book ever, I think. Not in the sense that I liked him as a person, because he is very unlikable and downright awful sometimes. But by the end, as you gain more insight into his character and understand his past and why he is the way that he is, and then see how he changes, he just was such a well-written character. And I was just so impressed by the way that the author wrote his arc and the way that we get to see him portrayed primarily through the eyes of Misaki. The first part of the book is a little slow, and we're kind of just sitting with these characters and getting to know them. But then about, a third of the way through the book or so, there's a major turn and everything is very fast-paced. There's a lot of action, and all of the setup of the characters and the dynamics between them at the beginning of the book really start to pay off in the middle and towards the end. And I think it was good that the author spent so much time setting that up and really just took her time with that part of the story, because it did pay off with a lot of emotional impact by the end. This is a war story, so a lot of brutal things happen, and sometimes it does get a little graphic. But if you can handle that, it's an excellent read and one that I would highly recommend. Just, make sure you have a box of tissues handy because it will probably make you cry. The next book I'll recommend is By Sea and Sky by Antoine Bandelet. And this is one of those books that sold me immediately just based on the premise, because it's a fantasy book about pirates and airships and a woman trying to save her husband. Like, yes, please sign me up for that. The story follows a woman named Zala, and her husband have joined up with this pirate crew out of desperation. The captain of their crew is a little incompetent at times and gets them into some risky situations where people are dying. And at one point early on in the story, they get into a battle with this airship, and Zala's husband is taken captive. So we spend the rest of the book following her as she is trying to find a way to rescue him. There's also another character whose point of view we get sometimes, and he is somebody aboard the airship. And so his point of view was really interesting too. It's a very fast-paced book from start to finish. There's always some new conflict that comes up that the characters then have to deal with. The focus is very much on the characters and their individual struggles. But the world building was really interesting, and there definitely is a sense of like a wider world beyond just what we're seeing in the story. That's something that I really hope the author will explore a little more in future books, because I was very intrigued by that and very curious to know more about the world and about the magic. Also, I listened to this one on audiobook, and the narration is fantastic on its own, but also there were some really cool sound effects that were mixed in there that I thought were just really fun. Every chapter would start with like some ocean sounds or some sky sounds, depending on whether we were, on like the island or the pirate ship or the airship up in the sky. And then sometimes like there were some subtle little voice effects, like if somebody was talking through a door, there was like a filter over the voice or something, so it sounded like they were actually talking through a door. I know that kind of thing can get overdone really fast and can be super annoying to some people, but I felt like this was a good balance, and it really just made the story, listening to the story, more entertaining, and I really enjoyed it. The next book I'll talk about is Voice of War by Zach Argyle. This was also one of the finalists from last year's SPFBO competition, and it was actually the finalist in the batch of books that my book was assigned to, and it was well deserving of that title. This is the first book in an epic fantasy series called Threadlight. The second book is out now as well. I have read that one too, and it was great too. I think I like the second one even more than the first, but we'll talk about the first one since that's where you have to get started, obviously. Our main character is a man named Chris, who is a soon-to-be father and a war hero who was responsible for defeating the enemy in a recent war that they had. In the story, Chris is tasked with figuring out why certain threadweavers are going missing. Threadweavers are the magic users in this world, and as he starts to piece that together, his family is threatened, and so he has to go on the run with them. Chris himself is a threadweaver, which means that he can use magic, and in this world there are different threads of light connected to like people and objects, and so threadweavers can manipulate those in order to do different things and interact with the world around them and use their magic. In a way, the magic system did kind of remind me of like certain parts of allomancy in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn books, if you're familiar with those, where people can push or pull on things to use their magic. I think if you're a fan of Brandon Sanderson, you'll probably enjoy this book. The writing style and even like just the storyline itself, I don't know, it just kind of reminded me of his work. Next up, I want to talk about The Goddess of Nothing at All by Kat Rector. This is the most recent book that I've read on this list. It is not out yet, but I think it's coming out very soon. It should be coming out on October 1st, I think. I actually got this as an advanced review copy, so that was really fun, and I was happy to read it. This is based on Norse mythology, and our main character is Sigyn, who is Loki's wife, and apparently she's not in a lot of the old Norse myths. So I thought it was really interesting that the author decided to focus on her. I felt like, maybe it gave her a lot of creative freedom in the way that she told her story, but also you could tell that there was a lot of just very careful research and thought put into this, just with some of the details and the way that the myths were told and explored. We get to follow Sigyn and Loki's relationship from when they first meet, and then as it kind of grows and develops, and we get to see them interact with some of the other Norse gods and goddesses. And honestly, a lot of those interactions are completely awful and horrible. No one in this book is really completely good or heroic. There are definitely some characters that you'll empathize with more than others, but everybody honestly is just very morally gray. All of them make really bad decisions at one point or another, and it just kind of becomes this awful circle of retaliation and suffering that's kind of hard to read about sometimes. It's a very emotional story. You do feel very connected to Sigyn and Loki as you're reading about their experiences, and watching their relationship grow and evolve over the course of the book was really sweet and adorable, but then also pretty heartbreaking as you get further along. I knew very little about Norse mythology going into this. I still don't know very much about Norse mythology, so I was a little worried initially about like being lost or confused about what was happening when I first started reading, but I felt like it was actually really easy to follow. So even if you're not familiar with the mythology, you can still, get invested in this and understand what's happening throughout the story. Even though it's a really sad story and not a lot of positive things are happening throughout the book, it was still a great read and I really enjoyed it. So if you're looking for something that's going to be an emotional roller coaster and that has some morally gray characters in it, or if you're just a fan of Norse mythology, I would definitely recommend checking this one out. Now we're going to end this on a little bit more of a lighthearted note with Organomics by J. Zachary Pike. This is a satirical fantasy novel that is set in the fictional world called Arth. There is a very robust economic system in Arth, which is built around this Heroes Guild. And the Heroes Guild is tasked with going out and completing quests and slaying monsters and recovering treasure and loot and that sort of thing. Members of the Heroes Guild often find themselves going up against like goblins and trolls and orcs, things like that. And those creatures are all categorized by the guild as being forces of evil. Regardless of whether or not they are actually evil, they all just kind of get lumped together. The treasure that the heroes recover on their quests is then divided up and sold to the highest bidder. And so our story starts when a dwarf named Gorm is tasked with recovering a certain artifact. He has to assemble a team of heroes to go on this quest with him, but there's also a lot of shady stuff going on behind the scenes that they're not fully aware of, and that really complicates their quest and just makes things harder for them. This is such a fun book. The writing is so clever. I cannot even tell you the number of times that I laughed out loud while I was reading this. There are a lot of references to fantasy RPGs and fantasy tropes, but they're not just thrown in there in a way to make a joke or something. Everything really comes together in a way that makes sense and feels very coherent and well thought out by the end of the story, so I really appreciated that. I knew going into this book that it was kind of just going to be silly and a fun time, and I really didn't expect much of anything deeper than that. But honestly, the characters ended up being surprisingly realistic and three-dimensional, and I really connected with some of them. The second book in this series is already out, and that was also really good, and the third book is hopefully coming soon because I can't wait to read it. That's all I have for you today. If you are looking for more indie book recommendations, I will be putting out a list with YA fantasy book recommendations very soon. I also have a page on my website with indie book recommendations, so I will link that for you in the description as well if you want to check that out. Again, I would really encourage you to read more indie books and to support those authors. I hope that this list gave you an idea of maybe where to start. And if you do read an indie book, please be sure to leave a review. Sometimes as an indie author, it's really hard to get reviews. That's kind of an uphill battle. So we really appreciate every single review that we get. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button to let me know, and also go down in the comments and let me know what your favorite indie fantasy book is, or if you've read any of the ones on this list. Please subscribe and ring the bell if you want to see more videos like this in the future. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Bye.